So I'm really behind in my reading, and I feel very, very bad about this. I am behind in my reading of People magazine. I discovered this week that back in December, almost a year ago now, this was the headline: Sofia Vergara's embryo daughters are going to sue her for the right to life. Now this really rather took me by surprise, because I thought to myself, well, that's the first time I've ever heard of embryos actually suing anybody. Of course, this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying, you know, there are outside of people who really want the money. And the money, of course, is really kind of a secondary object in terms of our discussion here today. What really fascinates me is that anybody cares about this, that this is something that is newsworthy. I mean, really, we live in a pro-death, pro-abortion kind of environment. Why should we care about such things? So this really struck me as something that People was going out on a limb for. You know, I was really rather shocked by this. So this made me think about other questions. It made me think, like, where did these statements originate? Where does the phrase right to life even come from anyway? And why is that so important? And why can we even say that there is a right to life? And what about this one? Why should we save the children? Who cares about the children? Why should we save the children, or save anybody or anything for that matter? And then this one, child abuse. Who is to say that abuse is right or wrong, or that children shouldn't be abused? Or this one, fetal homicide. What happens when a person who is in the womb is killed in a car accident, for instance, and it's somebody else's fault? Should they be held accountable for that homicide? Well, these are questions that are rather deep, aren't they? I mean, these are societal culture. But notice what our culture does. Our culture assumes rights. It assumes ethics. It assumes that there's something right or wrong, even though they have absolutely no basis upon which to build it. And yet, we have embryos suing a woman for the right to life. So here we have, we come to this concept of Genesis, and we understand that Genesis is a very important book. And it actually gives us some really important kind of headers for understanding life around us. So here's just one of them. Our view of humans, for instance. You'll notice that the picture over here is an anticipation of something yet to come. When I was discussing this with somebody here recently in the state of Indiana, that there are three major economic stability items in the state of Indiana, one of which is the concept of logistics. That is, that lots of trucks go from hither and yon out of places like Amazon and so on, out of the northwest corner of the city, actually. So the question then becomes, well, what happens when you no longer need truckers? What happens 10 years from now when logistics goes driverless? What happens to the jobs? These are very important questions, things that we should anticipate a decade from now in the state of Indiana. But I'm going to ask these questions based on the book of Genesis. I'm going to ask, where does robotics, self-identity, or abortion come into the issue? Self-identity, of course, you remember in our culture today, it's a very prominent phrase. I get to describe whoever I am, whether male or female or something else. Robotics, the same kind of thing. Should we be concerned about robotics? How about this? The Humanist Manifesto. I'll never forget this. Well, back in the 1980s, when I first started teaching, I would have my students read the Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2. And we would write papers on it and so on. And I remember, like it was yesterday, I was taking their flagship journal at that time called Free Inquiry. I think it's still published out of Amherst, New York. And I remember their great manifesto that came out about human beings. I'll never forget this. The very first line: we believe that humans have worth, value, and dignity. Oh, I couldn't write my letter to the editor fast enough. I wrote so many letters to the editor for Free Inquiry that never were published. I have them, by the way, in hard copy if you're ever interested in looking. But nonetheless, my question was, where do you get worth, value, and dignity? Who says anybody or anything should have worth, value, or dignity? And how about image of God directives? Where do these things come from? They come right out of Genesis. The only way that you can say that you're pro-life is not from Second Testament teaching. It doesn't come from Matthew to Revelation. It comes out of Genesis. That's why Genesis is so imperative to understand. So how about views of creation care? Why should we be concerned about creation care? And notice that I'm taking exception to the word environmentalism. Environmentalism really is a pagan concept, which suggests that we are just one among much of the earth. That is, human life is part and parcel of the world around us. But from a Christian vantage point, from a Genesis vantage point, we're discussing the issue of creation. I don't like to use the word environment. I like to use the word creation because of that. So why should we even be concerned about this? Why should we be concerned about something like overpopulation or recycling? Who cares if the fish get caught in our, what is that, the six-pack things, that float around under the water? Why should we care about such things? Was Malthusian theory right in the 19th century that said, boy, if we have more and more human beings, we won't have enough resources to actually feed everybody? Were they right? I mean, should we really be concerned about this? Should we take our lead from the culture? In conversation this week, this was being discussed at our house this week, a 20-something said, when confronted with the question of recycling, well, we just pretty much think about ourselves. It's interesting, isn't it, that these things kind of go in cycles. People get all jazzed about something and get on the bandwagon, and then it kind of falls off of, cultural impact. Well, I'm going to suggest that the only reason we get jazzed about any of this is right out of Genesis. Genesis 1:28, 2:5, 2:15, many places suggest that we bear the responsibility to manage and conserve the creation given to us. It doesn't come from the culture which mandates that we have some kind of recycling program. It comes out of Genesis. How about the arts and the sciences? Why do we even have an interest in STEM, STEAM, or STREAM? Picking an acronym here. I mean, seriously. Science, technology, engineering, and math. Science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And then add reading to the other, depending on how you want to spell writing, you could throw that in there. Some people actually like to talk about religion, so there's STREAM for you. How do we even connect to these things? Why do we even care about the sciences and the arts? This directive comes right out of Genesis. Genesis 2:9 says that the trees were made, they were good for food, but also pleasing to the eye, which is a fascinating idea. Stop to consider that when you go home today, you are going to fill your bellies with food because you're hungry. But then you're going to look outside at the beauty of creation and understand that the wonder of this creation that we observe is also good. So that we have the utility of eating, that is, sustaining ourselves physically, but we also have the artistic aspect of life, the aesthetics, the beauty of God's creation. Both of those things go together. They are not separated in God's Word. We get them from Genesis. And how about our view of ethics? What is the origin of right and wrong? Of course, in the last week or two, we've heard an awful lot about the hashtag #MeToo. And the issue of victim or villain or fault or shame. And I'm going to ask the question, on what basis do you have to say these things? What is it that is so compelling about this? Why should we do anything that's good? Of course, the standard and directive comes right out of Genesis. Genesis chapter 2. What does God say to human beings? He says, you are to follow my law. You get all of this creation to enjoy. There's only one aspect of it that I don't want you to eat from. And of course, we all know the end of the story. So, the standardized and the standard of sin and standard of righteousness comes right out of Genesis. So my point is the same. All of what we learn as the baseline of how we live today comes right out of Genesis. And it doesn't come any other place. So this week actually, we were discussing this in class. I teach a homeschool group, a senior group on Gothic oral literature. And in this particular week, we were discussing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And if you're not familiar with that great old novel, it is Dr. Jekyll decides that he wants to have a dark side. And so he takes a potion to change himself into this monstrous creature. And then, of course, he can revert back to it during the day and not feel the negative after effects. Until, of course, he does. And that's the whole point of the book. And it's really great metaphor about the problem that we face about our dignity and depravity. That there is good that comes from the image of God, but that image is distorted because of our father Abraham. So This was one of the comments from one of the young women in the class. I saw myself in the novel. How can you not? When you read great literature, when you read great books, you have to ask yourself the question, am I seeing myself? Am I literally looking in the mirror, which is what we ought to be doing? So why do we inherently know that we have a problem? Why is that? Well, I'm going to suggest that we inherently know that there's a problem because of this sign. I've been teaching for a long time, and throughout all of my years of teaching, I've said to students, I really wish that somebody would make me a metal sign that says, ever since Genesis 3, ... So back in 2011, I had a student teaching undergrad, and at this particular time, I made the same kind of comment, and for Christmas, this is what he gave me. He gave me this sign. So if you come to my study, and you walk upstairs to the second floor, come into my study, it's the very first thing that you see at the highest level. It sits by itself on top of a bookshelf, all by itself, ever since Genesis 3, ... And I've been using that phrase forever because it is the phrase that pays when it comes to understanding our problem. The problem begins in Genesis 3. So all of those items that I ticked off, arts and sciences and ethics and all of those other things, creation, care, all that good stuff that we say we should be doing, that comes out of Genesis. Guess where all the bad stuff comes from? Right out of Genesis. We start in Genesis chapter 3. The importance of the book of Genesis is huge. You can't bypass anything that we do in this life without, unconsciously most of the time, going back to the book of Genesis to say this is where we get this from. Now, because it takes me a long time to actually create these PowerPoints for everybody, and I am not very good at all of the graphics all the time, I decided to go old school on you all this week. So here's what I have to offer. I actually wrote this out by hand this week. Now this is something that you would see if you were in one of my classes, because I'm constantly writing on whiteboards. I was teaching a PhD course a couple weeks ago. They had 2 8-foot whiteboards side by side. They were all full in 2 hours. So there you go. This is the kind of thing that happens regularly when I'm teaching. And I wanted you to notice in particular this kind of schematic, because it really does kind of get after what we're really interested in. I want you to notice that this is a tree, okay? Yeah, I know, it might not seem like it. I won't ever win any awards for artistry here. But there's a tree above the ground, and below the ground are roots. And my suggestion here, and I've already included this, by the way, on your handouts, my suggestion here is that below the tree, in the soil, in the roots, are all of the great doctrinal teachings that give us all the good stuff that we get on the tree itself. So these are the theological roots, things like transcendence, which means that there is someone outside of ourselves. Who this person is also personal. He's eternal. He is a beneficent God. That is, he gives us great things. He is providential. All things are under his control. He's the creator of all things. So all of that theological basis now is the root for the philosophical fruit of what we understand about what's real. What's my purpose in life? How do I know anything? What is evil and how do I know that? What view of history should I have? Who are we as human beings? Why is life important? And on and on and on. So my suggestion here is that our theological roots are the basis for the philosophical fruits, those things that we live our lives by, whether, by the way, consciously or unconsciously. That's what Genesis teaches. So, where do these answers originate? Now, I'm not much on memes, those things that people post and they make a certain comment. I actually found one that I like. This is something that's really important. Don't forget, slavery was legal, the Holocaust was legal, segregation was legal, and the last line on this meme is wonderful. Never use the state as a metric for ethics. Never use the state as a metric for ethics, because what happens? If the state gives rights, what can the state also do? Take them away, baby. So, if God gives rights, the state's responsibility is to protect those rights. That's a huge, important concept in a democratic republic like we live in. So, when I hear people throw around this phrase, social justice, I'm always going to ask who's social and on what basis is your justice? Because otherwise, we don't have anything to talk about. You all are going to decide what's social for you. It might not be social for me. I might not care so much about your social. And justice? Who's to say what's right and wrong unless you have an external standard, a transcendent standard? What about human rights? Why should I care about humans or their rights? Where do those rights come from? Bias and prejudice. We're all biased and we're all prejudiced. So what? Who cares? Why shouldn't I be? Well, there's actually a place in Scripture that starts us off by telling us we shouldn't be. Genesis. Sexual harassment. Why is that wrong? Why shouldn't we harass the other sex? What's the problem with that? What's the standard by which we're going to evaluate this? And what about this famous line that teenagers are ever want to give? Who are you to tell me? And of course, this begs the greatest question of all of life, and that is who says? Who says is the most important question because it deals with the issue of authority. So who is my authority, and by what basis will I understand or evaluate any kind of action or word or thought? Well, there should be an authority outside of us. So, this is the most obnoxious objection I've ever run across. The Bible is outdated, irrelevant, impractical, and offers no help to the 21st century problems that we face. And my response is always the same. I smile and say, almost word for word, this statement. Oh, really? Are we still killing each other? Have we found the answers to war, disease, corruption? And if we haven't, then guess what? The Bible is still relevant and practical and applicable to real life. Because it is alone setting the standard for us, an outside source. This kind of suggestion is beyond the pale. So, this kind of sets us all up for the book of Genesis. Understanding that Genesis gives us all of this background and foundation upon which to stand and the authority to stand under. But I wanted also to give an overview of how the book of Genesis is actually laid out. And this is where your handouts are going to be really important this morning because there's an awful lot of stuff on there. All of it I've tried to give you as best I could on the handouts so that you can take this away with you. You won't have to write a lot of notes, that kind of thing. So once again, Mark went old school and he did the old, I'll draw it out because I can't take the time to create this thing. So this is a schematic now of what this actually looks like. And I wanted to take a moment to actually spend a few minutes with you about this. I wanted you to notice, first of all, that these dotted circles are specifically indicating that the action of the Pentateuch actually took place before the writing of the Pentateuch. So think of this. Genesis 1 to 2, 3 is about the creation. The only eyewitness to this was God. So the only way that Moses could actually recount this is because God has given it to him. So all of the action took place ahead of the writing of the book of Genesis. So Genesis, you'll see the little C there, is creation. Creation runs all the way through the book, all the way through the Bible. Very important. A, I, and J stand for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if you'll notice on the back of your handout, I highlight why this phrase, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is so important. And one of the keys to this phrase is that the anticipation of Messiah is coming out of this phrase. So you can look up all of those verses if you're so inclined, but all of those point to the same idea. That is that remembering Hebraic past, seeing the flow of history, anticipating the one who is yet to come to take care of all the problems that we see now. I wanted to make sure that you had that list and understood the importance of that because you'll see that all the way through the Bible. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, chapters 1 to 11 are about creation, 12 to 24 about Abraham, 25 to 36 about Isaac, and Jacob 37 to 50. And then after this, of course, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers and Deuteronomy are there as well. But this kind of gives you a schematic of how does this book fit with the rest of the Pentateuch. Pentateuch, by the way, means 5 scrolls or 5 books. Penta, 5, Tuch is scrolls. So these 5 books fit together, and they are written by Moses, and that's a really important understanding of getting the overview of this. Now, what's also important to understand Genesis, and much less the whole of Scripture, is this connection between Genesis and the book of Chronicles. Now this is really fascinating stuff. Genesis in the Hebrew Bible is the first book in the Hebrew Bible. Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew Bible. There's a reason for that. Without going into great detail, I wanted to point out one thing to you, and that is the issue of genealogies, the issue of lineage. If you read the book of Genesis, you cannot escape the book of Genesis without reading genealogy after genealogy after genealogy. And there's a reason for that. I'll explain a little bit further in some slides to come. But the point that I'm trying to bring here is what is called in Hebrew an inclusio, or as we might say, it's bracketed. So if you're into math, for instance, and you understand that what the action or whatever mathematical principles are taking place within the parentheses must be done before you do anything else outside of it, that's exactly what's going on here. Genesis is linked to Chronicles, the first and the last book, through the emphasis of genealogy, through the emphasis of lineage. Where did we come from, and why is this so important? So Genesis is crucial to understand the whole of Scripture, much less the wholeness of the First Testament. So, let me explain some of this. Again, all of this is all written out for you in your handouts, but this is a very important concept. This idea of the verses, well, I guess I suppose I should actually look at the handout in order to do this, right? So on the front of your handouts, you'll notice at the bottom I've given a schematic. One of the schematic is about, part of it is about the human race, the second is about the Hebrew race. And there's an emphasis there upon how do we break these things down. And you'll notice that I put verses in parentheses. The verses that I placed in parentheses are this phrase, the generations of, if you're using an English Standard Version. The generations of is the division of Genesis, all the way through. And there are 10 divisions. We'll talk about the number 10 in a moment. But it is a very different word than other words that are used for generations in the Hebrew Old Testament. It echoes the past, but it also anticipates the future. So the generations of looks backward, but it also looks forward. What's also very interesting about this word is that it's used in ancient Near Eastern king lists. Now, why in the world would this be important? Think about the importance of kingship in the ancient world. Kings, top dogs. Everything was top down in the ancient world. Nothing like we have in our culture today in the United States of America. So we have this ancient Near Eastern king list, which is using this particular word. What does that tell you? There's an anticipation of a king yet to come. The king is coming. The king is going to come through this lineage. This Genesis lineage is pointing forward to the king, anticipating the king, the Messiah. So, also you'll notice that I've given some plus signs on that particular diagram there. And the plus signs are next to certain names. So you'll notice that certain people, like Isaac, for instance, or Jacob, they get more attention in Genesis than, say, Ishmael. Why is that? Because God is placing his favor and his emphasis on one group of people than another. So that's the kind of the background to all of that and why that's so important to us. So here it is, all kind of laid out for us. Again, in parenthesis, this is where these phrases come from, the generations of. You'll notice the plus signs are where there is much more information given in Genesis about that particular group of people. And then those who aren't, I've identified by tabbing them in a bit. I also wanted you to notice this, that Genesis 1 and Exodus 1 are literally linked together. So when you think about the Old Testament being written, the Old Testament was written as one book. And this concept of the beginning of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus forces a number of questions for us. We'll talk about the questions in just a moment. There's one more thing I wanted you to notice about this, and I put it on your handout as well. I want you to notice the number 10. I want you to notice that the 10th member from Noah's line is actually saving the human race. So Noah and his line are saving the human race, remember, from the flood? And then the 10th member, this is Shem now, actually saves the human and the Hebrew race, because this person is going to bear Abram, who is now going to be the one to whom all people groups are going to be blessed if they follow Abraham. And then one more 10. The 10th generation saves the Hebrew race to serve the human race. The 10th generation of Jacob's generation is the one that saves the Hebrew race. Remember, this is Joseph, the story of Joseph, who literally saves people from the famine, who saves the Israelite line, who then is going to save the human race. Why is that? Jesus. This anticipation of the Messiah. Number 10 in Hebrew is considered to be a perfect number, a number of completion. And so even within the genealogies, even in the scope of all of Genesis structure, we see this marvelous statement. God is going to complete his work by bringing the Hebrew race to save the human race, specifically through the Messiah, through the King, through Jesus. So, Genesis answers questions. So think about this now. This book is being written after the Exodus from Egypt. Pause and think about this. Moses writes after the Exodus from Egypt. He's writing Genesis. He's writing Exodus. And after all of this, they've seen all of the 400 plus gods in the Egyptian pantheon. They've seen all of the 10 plagues against Egypt. They've seen all the marvels. And of course, they had to wait 400 years for this to actually kick in. All of these things they have waited for. And now Moses is writing this. God is speaking his word through Moses. And these are the great questions that the Israelites were having at that time. How did we get to Egypt? Well, Genesis answers that question. What kind of world do we live in? Genesis answers that question. What God do we serve? That's the big issue, especially in the book of Exodus. Who are you going to bow the knee to? Pharaoh or Yahweh? And then, of course, all of these other great questions. And all of these questions are the great questions of all of life that every culture, everywhere, asks all the time. Who are we? What's our purpose? What's right and wrong? How does history dictate our future? And what's next? What's next? So, I hope that I've enlivened you a bit toward the genealogy issue, because genealogies are hugely important, not only in Genesis, but throughout the Bible. A couple of years ago, pastors ask me from time to time to fill a pulpit, so I do. I love preaching. And 2 years ago, December 27th, 2015, I actually preached through Matthew's genealogy. So if you want to go back and listen to that sermon, go back to the website, you can hear all about this. I'm pulling some of those slides from this because I thought how much better it would be to help us understand the importance of genealogy, but to go back and forth between Genesis and Matthew. So here it is. The importance of Hebrew genealogies. Paternity. Where did you come from? Who was your father? That's a big deal in Hebrew culture. Legitimacy. The right people in the priesthood was based on a genealogy. You can't get past that in the book of Nehemiah. Naboth to Ahab, I can't sell you the vineyard because it's in the family line. How about that? Genealogy matters. And of course, Naboth loses his life to Ahab because Ahab takes it upon himself to kill him because he just wants the land. But this whole idea of lineage through genealogy is very important through Scripture. And then there are no posers in the Bible. So genealogies were legal documents. They exposed the poser. So anybody who was trying to come forward and say, hey, I'm the king, show us your genealogy. Not so fast. Wait just a second. Ancient biographers began a famous person's lineage with the genealogy to wrap their subject in tribute. So when you read in the ancient world that genealogies were pretty important, gee, how about that? The Bible has them too. What should that tell us? That genealogies are pretty important, and that this ancient book is true and historic and literal. Hebrew genealogies were legal documents. One had to prove social or political standing by them. You could not get away without having a genealogy in your back pocket, like having a passport through Hebrew history. You had to have that. Then there's this issue of hereditary rights. Hereditary rights were crucial for the Hebrews. Again, a Genesis to Matthew connection here to Jesus. The future position proved by past parentage. The past determines the future. Where did Jesus come from? Why is it that the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1 is so connected to Genesis chapter 1. We don't have time to go into the correlation between the two, but I would really emphasize to you sometime to go back and check this out. Not the least of which can we say that it is not only the beginning of Jesus' line in Matthew chapter 1, but it is his beginning of creation in Genesis chapter 1. Go back and check this out in Colossians. It's a very important passage, Colossians 1, 15 to 20. History is imperative for Jesus' claims. The incarnation, we're about to celebrate this coming up here in a couple of months, is historic. And the Hebrew race saves the human race again. So in Genesis, Jacob's line, Joseph comes through, saves the human race, saves the Hebrew race. Gee, what does Jesus do? Exactly the same thing. Everything is pointing forward, constantly pointing forward to what is yet to come. And then there's this issue of being pure-blooded. Now, if you remember the story of Jesus and Matthew 1 and 2, you remember that Herod was the bad guy in the story. Not only is he the bad guy, but he's not fully Jewish. Now, of course, he doesn't want anybody to know that he's not fully Jewish, because then he can't represent the Jews in Israel and Palestine. And so what does he do? He burns the records. Yep, just burns the records. We've never seen that in politicians ever in the past in the United States, have we? Nobody goes about burning records in the United States, do they? There are many of these things coming to my mind. We'll just bypass them all. The whole point of this, of course, is that he wanted to destroy the records so that nobody knew. What's fascinating to me is that before we get to the story of Matthew chapter 2, about Jesus, the kingship, all of that, you got to have the genealogy first. You got to show this is the man, this is the person that's come. This is God's anticipated son. This is what's so important. So, in the beginning takes us back and ahead. Remember that Hebrew word? It looks back, it also looks forward. The beginning of Jesus on earth in Matthew 1 is immediately reminiscent of Jesus' creation of the earth in Genesis 1. This in the beginning is a direct connection between Matthew 1 and Genesis 1. So, I started by talking about how this book relates to the things that we normally go through. Creation, care, ethics, why humans are important, things like this. And I thought, what better way to highlight the importance of Genesis than to really emphasize this particular passage, Genesis chapter 4. The famous story, of course, about Cain and Abel. Cain, of course, only brought some of what he was supposed to offer. He brought the leftovers, basically. Abel brought the first fruits. He brought the best. And, of course, this is the reason why Cain wants to kill his brother. By the way, there's a very important practical lesson here. That if you see somebody else better than you, what's the easiest way to show that they aren't better than you? Knock them off. Knock them off. So the best way for Cain to do that was to kill his brother. And ever since then, we've had the two directions, the two ways. Think about this all the way through the Bible. Think about this two directions bit, right and wrong, all the way through from Genesis through the Pentateuch into all of the teaching of First Testament. There's right and there's wrong. There's wickedness and there's righteousness. That's a very important theme. And then there are two choices. Who will you serve this day, Joshua says. For me and my house, we will serve Yahweh, not the other gods. That's a huge issue all the way through the rest of history in ancient Israel. Who are you going to choose to worship? How about this one, the difference between being foolish and wise? All the way through the poetic books, all the way through the wisdom books. We spent a whole last fall, talking about wisdom. Two ways. You can be a fool or you can be a wise person. Which one are you going to choose? Which choice, which road are you going to take? Oh, speaking of roads, Jesus mentioned them. He said there's a wide one and a narrow one. You get your choice. There's no third road, by the way. Okay, there's no extension to I-69 going out of this, all right? That was funny. I'll raise my hand. Thank you for that. All right. That just came to me. I guess some of these things just let that stuff go, right? Okay. Two roads, wide and narrow. Jesus emphasizes that. And of course, there are always two options between Jesus and the posers. Remember what Jesus said? I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus says, yeah, there's a whole bunch of other gods over there. Just don't lump me in with them. because my view of life and things is very distinctive. So, to highlight some concluding comments, some final comments. These are on the back side of your handout if you're inclined. I wanted to run through these because I realized that when I'm talking about the things I talked about concerning the structure of Genesis this morning, there's so much more to say, and I at least wanted to say a couple of words about each of these. Genesis history is a totally different account of human origins than other ancient Near Eastern stories. We talked about this the very first week. We talked about canonicity, the importance of how Genesis is so different from everybody else's view and story of how the world came to be. Don't forget that. If you missed that particular session, again, Liz taped all of these things for us, so they're up online at our websites, but also on the church website. Genesis history, totally different. Genesis 1 to 11 must be literal, historic, in order for the rest of Scripture to make sense. Why in the world would Jesus have to come and die on the cross for our sin, rise again from the dead, living for us today, coming again, if there was no literal sin? If there was no Genesis 3? So I don't understand those who would suggest that this is not literal, it's not historic, it's a poetic form, it really didn't happen, it's not necessary that it actually happened. Oh, baloney. You got to have that in order to have the rest of the Bible. By the way, I would talk to somebody that way. I just wanted everybody to know I'm just talking to you all. Okay. Number 3, the creation account explains why, who, what. A little bit of how, but is not concerned about when. I'm just letting that hang in the air for a moment. Those of you who know that there's this great debate going on about 6 days and whether or not there's theistic evolution and so on, that's not the point of Genesis 1, 1 to 2, 3. Now, you can build your scaffolding around and about it, but that's not what it teaches. What it teaches is, why are we here, and who's in charge of this, and what did he do for us? That's the important part. I'm not suggesting one or the other, by the way, is right or wrong. I'm just saying that's not what Genesis teaches. Competing narratives of how we are to view our world haven't changed. Environmentalism is as ancient as it is modern. The worship of things and trees and fields and streams, shoot, man, that goes way back to the beginning. Nothing new under the sun. Self-identity, that I'm a man or a woman and I get to decide, who's zooming who, man? That's Genesis. That's coming right out of Genesis. There's nothing new about this stuff. So all of these competing narratives about how do we view the Bible, and we think like this is brand new in the 21st century? No, it's not. Let me say that again. No, it's not. And finally, last year we talked about wisdom, and I emphasized in one particular session talking about the SPUD test. And the SPUD test is something that's sensible, practical, universal, and dependable. And I'm going to put this slide up here for us again to highlight this point. The wise person desires consistency, dependability, and seeks a stable basis for living. And so we expect that life will be sensible, practical, universal, and dependable. And we want that basis, that foundation, that permeation to come through all of life. Now, that doesn't mean that every culture has that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I am suggesting is that this comes right out of Genesis. What do we see as sensible, practical, universal, and dependable? All of those lessons that I started with today. Human beings, creation, care, all the rest. All that stuff is Genesis. You can't get it anyplace else. All right, we've got a few minutes for questions.
Okay, you made a big point about genealogies.
Yes.
And in New Testament, we have a genealogy from Adam to Jesus.
Yep.
Okay? Now, back to your point that there's no timing in this, but if we take that genealogy as serious, even if there's some missing generations, how would we get an old Earth to 4.5 billion years?
I wouldn't even begin to argue with you.
But then, is that genealogy, is it just missing stuff?
No, well, it's only missing stuff because the author of the genealogy decided not to include certain things. When you read just for the sake of saying this, when you read genealogies, you are not reading father to son to grandfather. There are no immediate linkages all the way through. Genealogies are more concerned, as I suggested in one of those earlier slides, with the theological point it's trying to make, not that this generation immediately was followed by this generation and so on. That's an important point, but I honestly wouldn't want to get into the other question about the age issue of the earth.
I haven't read it in the last week, but in the Book of Mormon, I remember being struck by, at the beginning, the people who were going to come over to America, they kind of dismissed genealogy. They're like, well, it doesn't really matter where we came from.
Right.
Let's just start the story. And I remember being struck by it because I'm like, well, that doesn't sound like a Jewish attitude at all.
That's right.
So, just
Yep, absolutely. Right on. Other thoughts, questions, comments?
So what does the Bible say about races? How many races are there?
Oh, there's one race. It's the human race. Every other, within that component of the human race are various ethnicities. So that's how I would describe that. And the issue, let's say for instance, if you take the word racism, it's really a poor word to use because it really doesn't identify the issue. Because we're all of the human race, the real issue is our ethnic background. Well, guess what? Next week, we get to talk about my second favorite book in the Bible, Leviticus. So until then, I'll see you.